All right. Hey, everybody. James from Accounting here again. Thanks for joining us on our Aim for Excellence webinar series, where we break down strategic, operational, and career-related best practices in RevOps with leaders in the space that we admire. Today, we have on a great guest, Jordan from CourseDog. Jordan started at CourseDog as Director of RevOps until being promoted to VP of Ops there. Thanks for joining us, Jordan. Do you want to kind of share your background in a bit more detail for folks?
Thanks for having me, James. Stoked to be here. Just I guess brief overview of myself. Started my career in finance, in investment banking, and sort of before transitioning to the kind of RevOps SaaS space. I spent the last 6 years leading RevOps at primarily two companies. So one, Loom PLG, where I spent about a year heading up RevOps there. And then I've spent more or less 5 years at CourseDog, sort of vertical SaaS company in the higher ed tech space. Um, Joined the company fairly early on, employee number 8, and we're about 200 folks now. So have seen sort of RevOps through quite a few different iterations of growth and maturity. And yeah, hopefully I have some, I don't know, useful perspective to lend.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm excited to dive in here, primarily from an analytics angle. I know, you've had some conversations with my co-founder Josh in the past, and it seems like you guys have really kind of nailed the analytics front. And then you kind of have to see a company through that scale. So we'll get into kind of the nitty gritty there, but I'd like to start pretty high level. Everyone has a different definition of RevOps, it seems. Like, how do you define RevOps?
I think I keep it pretty simple, right? It's the sort of people, process, and tooling discipline or set of frameworks that enable organizations to grow, retain, and expand business with customers, and hopefully in a fairly kind of predictable and customer-centric way. I think there's lots to unpack in sort of each of those three pillars, people, process, and systems. But at a high level, that's kind of how I think, and I sort of just apply that same framework to any kind of business unit that I might be working with.
Yeah, I like that. It kind of covers like the how, the people and process and frameworks, and also the goals in terms of like closing new business and expanding. So I think that's like a really good kind of like map to put in like, all the activities that you focus on.
Yeah.
From a career perspective, you started in investment banking. You said we share that in our background. Like, what led you into RevOps post investment banking?
Honestly, I'd be lying if I said anything but maybe happenstance, a combination of happenstance and luck. I joined CourseDog, as I mentioned, sort of fairly early on. I was employee number 8. At that point, we had maybe 15 customers. We're doing like 300 or 400K in ARR. And so folks had titles, but we were all doing everything. It was all hands on deck. So everyone was outbounding, everyone was closing deals, everyone was onboarding and sort of retaining customers. And it just so happened that the kind of first week that I joined the company, we had decided to implement Salesforce. Absolutely no one knew how to use it, leverage it. And I saw an opportunity to assume ownership over something that I knew would be pretty kind of intimately important to our growth should we continue to grow. And so I began spending weekends just like overtime really optimizing the system and the processes that it brought to life. And I kind of just fell in love with I don't know, like the systematization aspect of it, right? Like making I don't know, the mess of like people and process hopefully somewhat predictable and making sense of it all. And yeah, so my scope kind of just broadened from there. Obviously, picked up additional skill sets along the way, just as we grew, and that's kind of how I got into it.
That's awesome. I don't think I've ever heard someone excited about taking on a CRM implementation. I'm sure there's some more stories there that can be
Yeah,
unpacked, but we'll save that for your second time on the podcast. You joined CourseDog so early. I don't think I appreciated that it was truly as early as 15 customers, a few 100,000 in ARR. A little bit out of scope of RevOps generally, but like, how did you think about that decision? It's kind of like a scary proposition to join a company that early. Like, what gave you the confidence or the comfort in doing that?
this is why I say it's luck. I've learned so much in my time at CourseDog in particular, and I'd be lying if I said when I made that decision, I fully understood the risk or implications of it. Obviously, hindsight's 2020. It's worked out really well. We've grown tremendously. I've been here for, like I said, 5, 6 years. Um, we're continuing to grow, which is amazing. But again, I'd be lying if I said like at that point in time, I saw perfectly into the future, made a calculated decision. I think to the contrary, I was sitting in banking like pretty dissatisfied, unfulfilled with my day to day and my the career path that I saw before me, and an opportunity kind of popped up via my network to get involved in something that I thought would have a lot of value, and I knew it was fairly early on, and I kind of just like hopped at the bit.
That's great. And I'm glad it worked out. Not everyone is so lucky, so it's awesome to see. Kind of switching gears here to analytics. Analytics can be hard, especially in like a RevOps seat, because it really feels like they can be endless. I think there's often new requests coming RevOps way every day. tons of ways you can slice and dice, anything, especially when you're kind of running the whole funnel, basically. So if we start at like, the most basic as you think about analytics, like how do you think about the scope for RevOps? Like what should a company be measuring?
Yeah. Um, I think a few things. I mean, right, we could talk like through a whole set of basic kind of KPIs for sales, marketing, CS, product and engineering as well, that I'm sure, everyone's pretty much looking at. I prefer looking at it more sort of from a conceptual standpoint. So to me, it's all about leading and lagging indicators. Lagging indicators, and if you think about, to my point earlier on RevOps being sort of the people, process, and systems framework that facilitate the funnel, the lagging indicators would be the ability to easily identify and understand where your funnel is leaking, sort of at point in time now. Those are must-haves. I think those are sort of foundational pieces, just the ability to understand right now what's happening. Ideally, you also have leading indicators, i.e., where is your funnel likely or at risk to leak moving forward. So that's sort of one of the conceptual pieces I keep in mind. The other piece, and kind of going back to my point on making sense of the madness of the day-to-day, like RevOps, I think rightfully so, sort of gets painted or sort of tasked with being process guru or sort of data governance wizard, if you will. And so ideally, some of your analytics should help your leaders kind of easily enforce process and hold folks accountable. If RevOps is designed to, generate, retain, and grow revenue predictably, that only happens when folks are sort of executing a standard, sort of proven game plan. And so ideally, you have insight into how well day to day, week over week, you're actually executing against the processes that you've defined and iterated on. And the last kind of conceptual thing that I think about like analyzing or making sure that we're tracking is anything that's strategically relevant to the business.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to change company to company. For example, at CourseDog, one of the pieces that we're sort of laser focused on is a concept that we call sort of attach rate, which is how effectively our sellers can sell platform, right? We have a suite of kind of 9 technically individual SKUs or modules that our customers can purchase. We believe our value proposition is in being a true platform solution. So selling as much of those SKUs up front as possible versus a kind of more traditional land and expand motion. And so one thing that we're sort of constantly paying attention to is like what percentage of deals closed in a given period can be classified as, platform deals, which to us is like anything with 4 or more products on it. That's incredibly specific to CourseDog, but I think, when you evaluate your sort of like, I don't know, analytical or like KPI repertoire, there should be pieces not only that you'd find at every company, but things that are sort of strategically relevant to, your.
Yeah, I love that framing, and thanks for going through it. I love it because, you've proven that you've been able to add value through just, if I look at your resume, like your promotion to VP of Ops more generally than just Director of RevOps. And so often we chat with folks who are maybe mid-career in RevOps, and they have that question of like, how do I expand beyond just like the tasks of RevOps to get a seat at the table. And I think even the way you frame that up kind of showcases like the thought process and how you generate discussion beyond just the metrics. So I think that's a great example. I wanted to like double click into each of those 3 things just real quick, if you don't mind, because I think it's like really
Let's do it.
valuable. On the topic of like being strategic, I think the crystal ball example is a really good one, and that's how you start to add a lot of value. You mentioned like, can we create some leading indicators to figure out where like the funnel or the pipeline might be leaking? Like, do you have an example that comes to mind on that front of like maybe how you did this in the past to kind of put an example to kind of the higher level explanation?
Yeah, I think the most basic example that comes to mind would be sort of on the top of funnel side of things. We actually use a custom object in Salesforce that we call sort of the discovery call object, which for all intents and purposes you can think of as a mini pre-opportunity. These are records that get automatically created whenever our SDRs sort of book a discovery call under an account. They have a set of stages that move linearly as an opportunity would that our SDRs manage. And their close winning or coming to fruition is the creation of an opportunity. So at CourseDog, besides just assessing overall pipeline coverage, for example, getting a sense of even further up funnel, what our discovery call pipeline looks like, i.e. like potential to create discovery calls or how those discovery calls are progressing, how long it's taking us stage to progress them, i.e. like pre-discovery call to post, to how long it takes to set up a demo, to between how long it takes to have a demo and actually qualify the opportunity, as well as those conversion rates, are some of the ways that we can get ahead of what pipeline generation is going to look like in a given period. If you can get ahead of what pipeline generation is going to look like in a given period, you can probably get ahead of what bookings are going to look like. It's not always perfect, but to me, if you can like just begin to live in the data as upstream as possible, you kind of open up, yeah, opportunities to identify leading indicators that, hopefully make it so that all of your lagging indicators aren't so much of a surprise.
Yeah, that's awesome. I actually haven't heard about a custom object for kind of pre-op creation. I think it's a really cool idea, and exactly what like the board cares about, right? The board cares about seeing into the future, understanding that you'll have the pipeline to hit the bookings goal, and so it's pretty hard as like a marketing or DG leader to say with certainty like, will we hit that pipeline that we need? And I think like what you described is kind of a great way to kind of build some comfort. So I love that.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, just like I think it's all iterative. It's not perfect,
Sure.
and I don't want anyone listening to this thinking like CourseDog has the crystal ball and they forecast perfectly and it's completely predictable. It's just things that we're trying to improve at or like focus on day in and day out. And we nail it maybe 10% of the time.
Fair enough. Another thing you mentioned at the end of your kind of three examples was around enforcing process and data governance. I think one big challenge in the RevOps seat is you can create dashboard after dashboard after dashboard, doesn't get looked at. And so it sounds like that's not necessarily the case at CourseDog. Like you actually have sales managers, sales leaders in here making sure the sales process is being followed. How does that process work for you? Like how do you ensure it's being actioned? Like are you bringing this up in meetings? Like how do you generate like the productive discussion based on this to kind of make sure that like those processes are working?
I think a few things. I mean, yeah, cadences are absolutely a part of it. You should make the dashboards that you're building should be a part of your operating rhythm and should be used by the leaders of the business and should be viewed as genuinely valuable by everyone. So like individual contributors and managers and execs should all want to see the dashes that you built because they believe that they'll help them do their jobs better. I think the other piece that comes to mind is like getting as ahead of that conundrum that you described as possible, i.e., being thoughtful about the very real possibility that you build things that are never useful. To me, the best way to do that is to actually collaborate extremely closely with the people who are going to be using the dashes as you build them and then iterating on them over time. So I think another common pitfall is just like setting it, forgetting it, or making it a one-time exercise. We try on an annual basis to like revisit all of our sort of core ops stamp of approvals views in our BI tool. And we kind of vet those with the leaders of each vertical across the business to make sure that they have what they think they need to run their business units. So yeah, I guess high level takeaway, it's like cadences, build using them into your operating rhythm. And then as far upstream as you can, like you shouldn't be building dashes in a silo. They should be the output of like pretty close collaboration between RevOps or Ops and like each exec or each leader.
Yeah. And are you kind of pushing these out into the field, like to the leaders, saying like, "Hey, we need some clarity on if these processes are being followed," or is this more of a pull from like the functional leaders saying like they want the clarity?
I think it's push and pull, right? It's in an ideal world, you craft the process or the optimal processes or SOPs alongside the leaders.
Hmm.
And then you say, hey, we should also hold ourselves accountable to holding everyone accountable. And the best way to do that is to have visibility throughout the year on how well we're doing against this process that we've defined. So I at least personally in my experience, I've seen it be collaborative like from the very start. And I don't really think about it as in terms of like them asking for it or me pushing for it. It's more like symbiotic than that in an ideal in the world, in my experience.
Yeah, sounds really healthy. I think that's unfortunately not always the case. Sometimes get sales leaders who are so deep in deal management they don't want to think about process, but it sounds like you have like pretty good relationship on that front at CourseDog.
Yeah. I mean, kudos to our CRO and also to some of our other leaders who I think are fairly operationally minded and are invested in doing things like scalably and predictably.
Yeah, that's great. Next kind of question here. We can go as deep or as kind of shallow as you want to on this. Setting up the analytical infrastructure at CourseDog. There's a lot of things that can be done here. There's like CRM native reporting. There's gathering data sources. Some people will bring in a data warehouse to kind of crunch what they need. Like, how do you think about like, what you would recommend, at least from your experience at CourseDog, is like the menu of tech or processes or structures that you kind of need to have in place to do RevOps analytics well?
The first thing that comes to mind, and this is maybe like a getting around the question a little bit, but I think people make the false assumption that standing analytics up in and of itself is going to be a crystal ball into how the business is doing or how things are working. Like if you think about ops as like a sort of pyramid that builds upon itself, to me at the bottom you have, and these are sort of prerequisites for one another, right? At the bottom you have sort of what I would call core operations, which is just like in plain English, what are our processes and how are things supposed to work? Then you have the tools that bring those processes to life and automate them where possible and enforce them. And then you have the analytics that sort of are layered on top and provide insight. So I think one sort of false assumption that folks make is like implementing a Tableau or a Looker or whatever is just like instantly going to give you a whole bunch of insight that you didn't have. That could be true, but the fundamental prerequisite is like really clear process that people are following, that you're actually, and that you're collecting the data that you want in such a way that you want to sort of, that's going to allow you to answer the questions that you're after. So I think a little bit less about like, I don't know, foundational, like I think there's lots of tech stacks and ways of getting at pretty like advanced analytics. CourseDog for one, and this could just be a function of our scale and sort of nuance of our business, which is like we are definition like low volume, high ACV. Like we don't use a data lake, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So that sort of presents its sets of challenges as far as like snapshotting data and sort of like pipeline management. But it also makes it easier to sort of wrangle fewer systems, if that makes any sense.
It does. It makes total sense. I like the pyramid idea or framework a lot. Any advice for folks, let's say if they feel the need to kind of start at that base level, like how would you advise people to go about like figuring out that kind of base level of SOPs or kind of operational procedures? Like, is there a mental model you have of like, if we're starting with a blank canvas, like how we can get to that?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, there are lots of like, I mean, in the sales world, for example, there's lots of like proven methodologies or whatever. In the context of sales, I just think a lot about like linear stages. What are our entry and exit criteria? And what's the sort of like perfect balance between our internal business processes, the I's and T's we need to dot and cross, balancing all of that with like our customer's journey. Like if we have this perfect process, it doesn't really matter if all of the like logic behind it and the wording of it means nothing to our customers or to our prospects. And so it's sort of a balancing act there. Um, the other thing that comes to mind is like I think lots of folks aren't starting from scratch, and so I think a really good way to know if you have sort of good process, besides the ability to analyze the underlying data, is to literally just ask an IC in any function like how they do a certain aspect of their job. Ask like six of them and see how different their answers are. The more similar they are, the better your process is, and the more that they diverge, probably the worse it is.
Yeah, I love that. I think you always have to pair that qualitative insight with like whatever you're doing quantitatively, right? To make sure you fully understand what's actually happening beyond just the numbers.
100%. Yeah.
Any specific, and I don't want to spill too many details on CourseDog, their internal secret sauce, but like any analytics or analyses that are super important for you guys as you think about kind of like the customer journey, like anything you guys live and breathe by. I know you mentioned leading indicators on pipeline earlier, which I think is really interesting and sounds like probably guides a lot. Anything else like is kind of, on your guys' top of the kind of pyramid, a different pyramid than the framework you gave of like what's really important for you guys to be tracking day in and day out, or what actually drives the business forward?
The only thing that comes to mind is a little bit specific to CourseDog and maybe like, I don't know, enterprise vertical SaaS, which is we pay a lot of attention to our deployments. So we have a long sort of enterprise sales cycle and then long complex deployments. And we have found that our implementation experience and our ability to implement and deliver value quickly and effectively is more or less the only thing that matters as far as retaining and growing our customer base. And so we pay a lot of attention in terms of like the utilization of our professional services team, time to value. We've begun to pay closer attention to like the margin profile of each of our implementations or each of the functions involved in our implementations. Yeah, again, this is very specific to CourseDog, but unless I think like broadly applicable. So I might have to get back to you on a better answer.
Yeah, no, I think it's super helpful. Actually, kind of what I was looking for because I do think like you guys have a smallish TAM. I'm not sure how many universities there are in the U.S. Maybe 5,000. Is that
If that, yeah.
If that, yeah. And so I think there are other industries like that too, where I think RevOps has like unique set of challenges that aren't as well evangelized because it's not like the high velocity model or the PLG model that's kind of all the rage these days. So I think deployments is like a great example of how you might like be really focused on like the big accounts.
I always say our TAM is a blessing and a curse. It's a curse because obviously it would be nicer if it were double, triple, quadruple the size. There would just be more, more territory to go carve up. But it's a blessing because it means we can be extremely intentional and data driven and insightful with every part of the customer journey. So yeah, pros and cons.
Yeah, that's great. This is super interesting. I know we're almost at time here. We like to finish usually with like a rapid fire, one or two word answers just to a few questions.
Sure.
So take through it here. What's the biggest myth about RevOps?
Biggest myth about RevOps is that it's just sales ops. I feel like that's probably the most common answer you get to that question, but I think it is the biggest myth.
Yeah.
I think there are genuinely cases where sales ops teams have been just simply rebranded as RevOps. To me, there is a fundamental difference though between sales and RevOps, where RevOps is a centralized operations function responsible for sort of stewarding, again, that people process and systems framework that informs the entire customer journey versus sales ops, which is a part of it. But yeah, I think the biggest myth is that RevOps is just sales ops.
Yeah, that is a common answer. It's probably second to that RevOps is just a CRM jockey. Although I think that's starting to change.
Okay.
People are understanding the value of RevOps more, which is great.
Nice.
Next question: biggest sales rep pet peeve?
I love working with salespeople. I wouldn't say that I have a sales rep pet peeve per se. Like the only thing that really comes to mind is, and it's not, I don't think it's even unique to sales folks, but it would just be like people asking for things or tools that they don't actually wind up using or needing. RevOps is, I think, always, we're fundamentally a cost center. Obviously, there's ROI, we deliver value, but like we're not a directly revenue generating team. And so we tend to be staffed a little bit more thinly. And so I think, when it's easy for us to get stretched in tons of different ways. And so when people are asking for things that they don't really need, that can be frustrating.
How would you describe a great RevOps leader in 3 words?
I think someone who's like really empathetic, can relate to people and understand their pain points extremely well. Someone, sort of word of the day, who's like analytical, wants to genuinely understand how something works and how they can improve it. And then maybe like resilient. I think oftentimes people are only going to come to RevOps when things are going wrong, when there's a problem to solve. And so you're probably not the first function to be celebrated. And so being able to just kind of be the calm in the storm is a huge asset.
And last one piece of advice you give to someone starting out in RevOps today, maybe starting their career.
I mean, just based on my own experience, I would say get your hands as dirty as possible. Don't fear ownership. My experience has told me or taught me that RevOps's strategic value lies in its intimation with the tactical day to day and the ability to kind of operate at all levels and bridge that kind of strategy to execution gap. And so early in your career, if you can become a true subject matter expert on the day to day functions and like what makes them work, as you grow and assume more ownership, like you'll be able to flex back into that role while also sort of speaking for the business at a more macro level. So I guess, yeah, takeaway is, or TLDR is like, assume as much ownership as possible and just like get your hands as dirty as you can.
That's fantastic. I don't think there's a better place to end than that, and clearly it's worked for you. Jordan, this was super interesting. I think really valuable. I'm excited to get it out into the world. Anyone listening, if you have questions for Jordan, feel free to funnel them my way, and I'll run them by Jordan and get back to you. Of course, if you have any questions about accounting, you can reach out to me at any time. Jordan, thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, James.